Boom! Yes, folks. Hume here again. How are you going? Long time. Right? Long time I drop a video and thing. Alright? So we're back in the political thing now. Election thing. Right? Local thing. Trinidad thing. More specifically, Tobago thing. THA elections, January 12th, 2026. So, as a Trini from South, with no Tobago ancestry, I made the extra effort to try and get into the Tobago elections a little bit, because most Trinidadians who don't have a direct connection to Tobago, either by ancestry or by other family, or maybe you're living in Tobago, you're working in Tobago, or maybe you have a Tobago spouse or something like that. Tobago girlfriend, Tobago boyfriend, or a Tobago best friend, or whatever. Tobago mentor, right? And sometimes even those of us with connections to people from Tobago, we don't really pay much attention to the Tobago elections, simply because it's not something that we into all the time the way the Tobagonians would be into it. Right? We're familiar with the Trinidad elections, the local government elections in Trinidad, we're familiar with it. We know about the regional corporations and the borough councils and all of that. Of course, everybody familiar with the national elections, general elections. But the THA is something that a lot of Trinidadians not familiar with. And I will bet that most Trinidadians who don't have a strong link to Tobago, a strong link, not just a regular link, a strong link, they would be hard pressed to name two of the Tobago seats. Just two. I know I was in that situation, and I wouldn't be ashamed. I wouldn't be ashamed to come and admit it. Yeah. Before I sit down and went through the thing on the EBC website, I didn't know any of the seats. I might be able to call one or two now off the top of my head. Right? So I still would take some time to get a sense of, all right, maybe I could pinpoint 5 or 6. That would take a little time. But the point I'm making is that most of the Trinis, the Trinidadians in the Twin Island Republic, we don't really know much about the Tobago elections. All we know is that they have an election in Tobago. It was 12 seats up to January 2021. It is now 15 seats as of December 2021. We will know the results, and we will be able to put the results within a national context, in the sense of PNM in Tobago, well, UNC not in Tobago, but there may be other parties that might be more leaning towards UNC, etc., etc., etc. But in terms of the seats and the voter patterns and what might happen and all that, we really don't know. Most of us, we're just waiting on the results election night to see what will happen. Or we might talk to one of our Tobago friends, or a couple of our Tobago friends, to get a sense of what's going on the ground in Tobago. That is as far as most of us would get as Trinidadians who looking on from a distance at the Tobago thing. So what I did, numbers thing now, I say, aha, the EBC have all the data on the website, and big pips to the EBC listener, man. Trinidad and Tobago, I think, is an outstanding model of what the democratic process is supposed to be. We're much better off, and we have a much better process than some of the larger countries in the world that has been making the news all the time. We don't have gerrymandering and thing down here. Right? The EBC is an independent organization that will draw maps and rearrange districts and things based on population movements. People move from one place to another place, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, we don't have to deal with partisan gerrymandering as happens in a certain country, right? The country that likes to claim that them is the best democracy in the world. But there's a separate conversation. We have the best, well, one of the best. So big up to the EBC, and let us hope that it remains independent and we can know all right. Anytime the EBC interfere with a boundary, there is a valid reason for that. And we had a couple of those in the same Tobago context, which we will discuss a little later, right? So I went on the EBC website, I dig up the figures and thing. I went into the history of past elections and all of that, just to get a general sense of. And then, of course, you start to analyze the figures. You get a little graph and then get a little data and thing, right? And then, of course, I used the statistical tool of linear regression, which is something I've been doing since 2020, as a means of trying to project what could happen in an election mathematically, bearing in mind, of course, that an election is an inherently non-mathematical process, right? The reasons why somebody will leave the house and get up to go and vote for a particular party have nothing to do with maths. The process and the counting and a huge part of the political campaigns might be very mathematical, right? All the parties would have the statisticians and the mathematicians and the historical data and the charts and the graphs and the polls and the pollsters and all them kind of thing. Yeah, serious mathematics in that. But the emotional factors that drive elections and election results could discombobulate, if I could use a word that was made popular by Mr. Fitzgerald Hines in the local parlance, in the local context. The non-mathematical factors could easily dishevel and discombobulate all the maths you do. And that's how it is sometimes. So sometimes you do the maths and they make a certain projection and then the results come out, boom, and they get it correct, right? Which was the case for me in 2020 with respect to the general elections. I would have made certain projections that was different projections to what everybody else was saying, and boom, it came out exactly as I said it would have come out. And then in 2025, the story was a little different. Granted, I didn't get enough time to really dig into it because the election was called in a kind of snap election, right? So the time that I was planning to take to dig it up and prepare it and think, boom, elections called, you had to try and do something quick. And the projection that I made turned out to be way off of what actually happened in the 2025 results. Does that mean that what you do was a waste of time? No, it does not. Because even in the analysis where the projection was wrong, there were a lot of very vital nuggets and very vital trends that I would have been able to pick up just by going through the figures that I would not have been able to pick up otherwise. And in fact, in the 2025 election, in my own private conversations, there were certain things that I was telling people about certain seats, that if so-and-so happened, so-and-so will happen. Right? So for example, when I was doing I did the marginals, so I went into San Fernando West. And it was because I went through the numbers, I realized, well, wait, this thing's serious. Faris could be in some trouble here. Right? A lot of P&M supporting people didn't really pick that up. Right? The people from San Fernando were telling me that, yeah, there was a certain level of discontent and all of that. But a lot of people didn't really realize in terms of picking up the non-emotional factors. But I was able to say from my own analysis that the number of UNC voters wasn't going to increase by a whole lot. But if the PNM voters stayed home, Friars will be in trouble. And that is exactly what happened in San Fernando West. All of that to say that statistics is an inherently uncertain process. 2 and 2 is 4 anywhere you go in the world, in any language. Doesn't matter who says it, and it doesn't matter who says otherwise. Statistics, however, is a different beast, right? And sometimes you have numbers and you could analyze it in a lot of different ways. So I saying all of that as a preamble, so that when I start to play with the numbers, you'll try to get a sense of where I'm coming from, right? And you might see something a little different. That is fine, right? Once you could try to explain yourself, that's the most important thing, and then we will see what happens at the end, right? And as well, I will declare my own bias up front. Well, political bias, not numerical bias, because numbers are numbers. Although people try to spin numbers, that is not my record, right? 2 and 2 is 4, whether you're supporting the PNM or whether you're supporting the UNC. And 2 and 2 is 4, even if the party that you supporting trying to convince you that is 5. Right? So, as somebody who has consistently voted for the PNM, I throw in that in so that if somebody decide that they want to invalidate what I'm saying because they know that Hume does support the PNM, well, that's your business. That is all right. Right? My record says otherwise because, I mean, there are times when I would say something that, say things that is different to the messaging of the party. And then fellow supporters of the party, you find them moving different with you. Right? A couple of them pretend that they didn't see me in the road around the time of the general elections last year and a little after. But that's all right. That's all right. I love them still. Right? So I'm going to delve into the figures now. Right? So check it out. We have little graphs and things. We go talk about the graphs. And then at the end, I will give my own analysis in terms of what I think might happen in the election itself. All right? So we're going to start by going across the graphs, going into the regression, seeing some figures, and then we'll go into the actual results based on what we have from the last election in the THA. All right, so we are here now with a graph of the Tobago electorate. All right, this is just the raw electorate from 1980 straight down to December 2021, and we use the information and the mathematics associated with it to project what the electorate should be based on the past trends. All right, now of course the EBC will give their final figure eventually, but in the absence of that, at the time of doing this video, at the time of writing the article on Substack, where I have all the details of the calculation and stuff, I took the opportunity to use linear regression to forecast or to predict or to project what the actual raw electorate should be. And using the mathematics which I worked out in the article itself and the equation that is seen there, I was able to get a figure of 55,468 for the raw electorate. We will see how close we get to the actual figure when the EBC does in fact release the official numbers for the final electorate for the elections, the final numbers for the full electorate. All right, so the Tobago electorate in 2026 January, based on this, should be 55,468. Note that we have the trend line here, which I discussed in the article. This dotted line here is what we call the trend line, and the trend line would have an equation associated with it. We discussed that in the article as well. I don't want to get into all them details in the video here. All right, So here now is where the bacchanal start. This is the voter turnouts. This is the one variable. This is the one mathematical variable that would have that is very much correlated with the actual results. Your voter turnout. You could detect certain trends, and you could get a suspicion of what certain results might be based on the voter turnout alone, right? Of course, you would add in non-mathematical variables to that. But the voter turnout by itself is very, very informative, and we will discuss that in a little bit, right? Again, you see the voter turnout fluctuating, and you see the trend line. So the general trend from 1980 to 2021 is for the actual voter turnout. We actually see the trend line moving downwards. So over the 41 years, the general trend, based on the mathematics that we're using, is that the voter turnout in the THA elections is on a downtrend. All right. Of course, you have your little spikes, right? You had a spike here. We'll discuss that a little later. And then you had a little small spike there, right? And of course, you had a spike in the second THA election. That was in 1984, right? We'll see the figures for those in a little bit. But based on that dotted line there and the calculations that we would have utilized using the maths, the calculations we would have done using the maths that we have available to us here, the voter turnout using this worked out to 53.1%, which is pretty low. Again, we'll discuss that in a little more detail not too long from now, right? So because of that low number, I went a little more in detail. I say, nah, I wouldn't just stop at 53.1%. So what I did, I looked at these three here, which I will also discuss in a little more detail. I looked at this. This would have been 2017. This would have been January 2021. And this would have been December 2021. All right? So let me just actually point at it in case some people not seeing the arrow clearly. Right? This here is December 2017. This here is January 2021. This here is December 2021. So between those three THA elections, you see a slight uptick in the voter turnout, right? We're going to discuss all that just now, don't worry. So I took those three and I did a separate trend line for those three, right? 2017 here is the first one. 2017 here is the first one. January 2021 is the second one. And December 2021 is the third one. All right, so we have an equation associated with the line as before, and using this equation, I was able to get that if this trend is the one that holds for the next THA election on the 12th of January, then the voter turnout would be 60.1%. So I give myself a little range for the voter turnout because voter turnout is the most difficult variable to predict. Sometimes you could get a sense of whether it's high or whether it's low. Sometimes you wouldn't even know until the night of the election results itself. So for voter turnout, I don't like to, I mean, you could get a general number, but sometimes your instincts will tell you, nah, do something else just to get a little more information. So that is what I did. So the range that I'm working with is 53.1% to 60.1% for the voter turnout in the THA elections on the 12th of January. So we will see what all of those things mean or could mean politically speaking. So let me go to the next set of graphs we have here now. Let me see. All right. That's not, hold on. Let me do this one here first. All right, so I want to focus on this particular table here, right? If you notice, you have the different years for the THA elections. We have the voter turnout, and then you have the party that won the election, right? And then you have this column here, which I refer to as delta T, T for turnout, right? Delta T refers to the change in voter turnout over the previous election, all right? So the delta T here is 3.9. 3.9 would be 70.1% in 1984 minus the 66.2% in 1980. This figure gives you a sense of whether the voter turnout increased or decreased over the previous election. And as you see, we have some very interesting figures here. So I'm going to start the actual discussion of what may or may not happen on the 12th of January from this table here, right? If you notice, you have the general range over which the voter turnout fluctuates is between 43.9%. That's the lowest. This would have been in 1996 when the NR won. And then you have 70.1% on two occasions, in 1984 when the DAC won, and then in 2013 when the PNM won. Those are the highest values we have on record for the voter turnout. All right? The 3 points we just discussed at the end there, the 2017, January 2021, and December 2021. Look them here, 49.7%, 51.8%, and 57.0%. So you're seeing the general increase, right? So there was a 2% increase in voter turnout between January 2021 and 2017. And then the voter turnout increased by even more, by 5.2% between January 2021 and December 2021. So the question we might want to ask is, are there any patterns that we could discern based on the voter turnout? The first thing I want to mention is that the ruling party, based on the historical data here, the ruling party generally is able to survive a decrease in the voter turnout. So, for example, in every case where the voter turnout dropped, there was no change in regime, right? In 1988, the voter turnout was 16.6% less than it was in 1994. Well, DAC and NAR, for most intents and purposes, are more or less the same. So I wouldn't treat NAR as a different party to the DAC. The Tobagonians might have something this year, and that's no problem, right? I'm talking as a Trinidadian here. In 1996, the voter turnout dropped from 56.1 in 1992 to 43.9 in 1996. That's a drop of 12.2%. NAR survived that, right? Minus 5.7%. The PNM won with a voter turnout of 60.1% in 2001, and then it dropped by 5.7% to 54.4% in 2005. PNM survived that, right? So, and then look, PNM survived here again. From 2013 with a voter turnout of 70.1%, in 2017, the voter turnout was 49.7%. PNM still in power. So even when you have huge drops in voter turnout, 16.6%, 12.2%, 20.4%, the ruling party, based on this historical trend, was able to survive in every instance, right? And that gels with the general school of thought in electoral discussions, where they say that a low voter turnout usually favors the ruling party usually, because that didn't happen at the national level in 2025 at all. But that's a different conversation. But based on what we have here, if your voter turnout drop, you could survive that, right? That is what the numbers saying. The other thing I want to discuss now is the other extreme. Anytime you have a large increase in the voter turnout, that was usually accompanied by some significant event. With the I wouldn't describe this as a large increase because it does increase from 66.2 to 70.1. But look at this here, 16.2%, right? The PNM, the voter turnout increase from 43.9 to 60.1 between 1996 and 2001. And what happened? You had a shift from the NAI to the PNM. In 2013, the voter turnout jumped from 56.4 to 70.1. And what happened there? This was the first time and the only time so far that any party would have won all of the seats in a THA election. So this massive voter turnout in this massive voter turnout in 2013 of 70.1%, that is what happened when the PNM won the 12 seats, right? So that voter turnout is what spurred, is what catalyzed that particular result. So the other thing I want to discuss now is that the voter turnout increased. That's not, hold on. Bam bam. Which one I was looking at? It was this one, and this one, and this one. Hold on, let me just check my notes. Let me double check my notes here. I have it in the article, eh? Hold on. I'm looking at, let me see. I'll tell you in a little bit. Part 2. 2 articles are right here, you know. And of course, these 2 articles will be accompanying this video, so that by the time you see this video, the 2 articles will be available as well. Right. So the pattern that I want to discuss is that, and I'm going to quote from the article here. It says, in 2 instances only, the voter turnout showed a net increase over the previous voter turnout in 2 consecutive elections. And in both instances, the culmination was a victory of whitewash proportions for the winning party. So that is reflected in the table, and we'll go to the graph in a little bit. In the table, you see 2.0 here and 13.7 here. So between these 2 elections, that built up. So it's like a momentum building up then, right? The voter turnout increased by 2% from 05 to 09. And then it increased by 13% from 09 to 2013. That led to a PNM whitewash 12-0 in the THA elections. Similar story here. The voter turnout increased by 2.1% from 2017 to January 2021. And then it showed a net positive again, increasing by 5.2% from January 2021 to December 2021. And that led to a 14-1 scoreline for the PDP. PNM was 3 votes away from getting a clean sweep. Right? So the idea is that as the voter turnout increased, these 2 are the only times when you had a positive delta T for 2 consecutive elections. And that's, so in other words, it's like momentum building up over the course of 2 elections, and then something big happened, boom, and one party win with a massive, almost total landslide. Well, in the PNM's case in 2013, it was in fact a total landslide. All right, so let me go to the graph now. We're going to look at this in a slightly different way. Wrong. Right, so this is what I did here, right? This here in the red circle, this is 2005. Let me point. This is 2005. PNM would have won 2009 and then 2013. So you see, looking at the lines, you see that general movement up. Contrast that with this part of the graph here, where you go up and then you go down, and then you go up and then you go down, and then you go up and then you go down. It reminds me of Lady Lava song. Up and a down. Different conversation. Alright? Now, you have another instance here where you have two ups. 2017, January 2021, December 2021. I put the circle in green. That is PDP. This here culminated in a 14-1 for the PDP. This here culminated in a 12-0 for the PNM. So, on the two occasions where the voter turnout increased in two consecutive elections, that led to a whitewash for the winning party. All right? So, you're seeing some trends there, and that now would allow me to say the following with respect to the voter turnout. Right? Because based on the trends that we identify so far, bearing in mind that the mathematical projections, right? The numbers we have based on the maths, they seem to suggest that the voter turnout should lie between 53.1% and 60.1% based on my working of the maths. So we have a 7% range there, right? The question is, what is likely to happen inside our range? We're starting with inside our range first, and then we'll discuss outside. In fact, no, let me do the reverse. Let me go outside. So let us say, for example, that the voter turnout drops. The last time the voter turnout was, the voter turnout was, the last voter turnout was, we come into that just now. The last voter turnout was 57%, right? Which is not the highest figure for a voter turnout, but we saw what the lines are saying, right? So in other words, if the voter turnout drops below 57%, you see it here in green, then based on what I have seen happen over the 41 years, unless something radically different happens, the PDP should be safe in terms of retaining power if the voter turnout is so low as to dip below the 57%. So in other words, based on everything we discussed so far, remember we discussed the fact that ruling parties seem to be able to survive a decrease in the voter turnout. So in other words, if this line drops for the 2026 election, then I would expect the PDP to retain power in the Tobago House of Assembly. If, however, the line continues moving up, which is to say that, well, hold on. Remember the range we're looking at is 53 to 60, 53.1 to 60%, 60.1%. So it could drop from 57 to 53. It could drop from 57 to 54. It could drop from 57 to 55. In other words, if it dropped below 57, it should favor the PDP. If it go below 53.1%, well, I mean, I really don't expect the PNM to win the THA election if the voter turnout is below 53.1%. Between 53.1% and 57, what it was? Between 53.1 and 57, where's the numbers here, boy? 57.0. Between 53.1 and 57.0, I still expect the PDP to hold on to power. Anything greater than 57%, and you know, PDP might want to start being a little bit concerned, because greater than 57% would mean that you're continuing upwards. In which case, for the first time in THA history, we would have a situation where the voter turnout increase net positive for over three consecutive elections. Right? So 2017 to Jan 2021, Jan 2021 to December 2021. So that's the 3 elections there. 2 positive changes, and then we would have a 4th election in January 2026. Your 3rd change, if that change is positive, meaning that the line goes up. That is where things, I think, would start to become interesting. So anything over 57, right? Remember the original range we were looking at is 53.1 to 60.1. So 57.1% to 60%. Well, 57.0, sorry, to 60.1%. That, to me, would suggest a competitive election. To me, that would be like what we like to refer to in political discussion as being too close to call. That might be a 8-7 one way or the other, or a 9-6. For the absolute most, the scoreline might be 10-5. Who exactly would win? The history would suggest that anything over 57% would favor a PNM victory, and it would be close, right? But if it's close, it could go either way. It could swing, right? So 8-7 is 8-7. That could be anybody, all right? Anything over 60.1%. Let me say 61%, 62%, 63%. Let me say, for the sake of argument, the voter turnout is 70.1%, which is the highest voter turnout in the history of THA elections over 41 years. Then at that level of voter turnout, I don't expect the PDP to win the election with a voter turnout, if there's a voter turnout of 70.1%, simply because the historical data suggests that with a voter turnout at that level, coming after, hold on. Let me get the numbers. Come. Right, so coming on the heels of 49.7%, 51.8% and 57%. If your next election is 70.1%, that, I believe, will be accompanied by a change in the regime, as has been the case every time there was a huge jump in the voter turnout. So 70.1%, that would be an increase of 13.1. 57 plus 13.1 is 70.1. So I don't think the PDP would survive a 13.1% increase in voter turnout if that is what happens on the 12th of January. All right? Okay, we're coming back here just now. Hold on. So let's go back to this graph here. Right, so just to recap in terms of what I expect to happen with the voter turnout, based on the historical data that we just discussed, a voter turnout of less than 53.1% PDP. In other words, if less than 53.1% people come out to vote, PDP should win by a very clear margin. A voter turnout of between 53.1% and 60.1% would be competitive. Of course, the closer to 53.1% you get, the more likely it would be that the PDP would win. And the closer to 60.1% you get, the more likely it would be that the PNM would win. Right? Within that range, I expect this score to be kind of close. 8-7, 9-6, maybe 10-5. Right? And then, of course, if we go above 60.1, at that point, I expect the PNM to be putting some daylight between themselves and the PDP in terms of the number of seats won. And if it gets anywhere close to 70.1%, well, at that point, I think people would have to start moving out of the THA, and people would be preparing to move in to the THA. All right? So that's basically it with respect to the voter turnout. There's another set of data I want to discuss. We're here already, so let me discuss it, right? You know I like to go in the video where you can see my face and thing, but the charts telling a proper story here, so I want to stay here. So this little table here is a table that I have. I have seats that I am referring to as likely PNM. And I will tell you why I refer to these seats like this now. I have the toss-up seats, and then I have the likely TPP. Right? So we'll probably come back to this at the end, but I want to shift now back to the whiteboard because I want to discuss some numbers with all of you. Right? I want to stand up and talk to all a little bit, and I want to stand up in a position where I can see the numbers and talk about them, and then we could come back here as we get closer to winding up the discussion. All right, so we're back in front of the board now, right? If all you find the light looking a little different in this clip is because sunlight now coming in. Yeah, some crazy hours. This is one of those situations where the hours may be crazy, but you can't be lazy. Right? Sometimes you find again late and you go and sleep, but today is not one of them days. Right? So I want to discuss a particular set of numbers that lead me along the path that you just saw in the table there, because while I was able to do a regression analysis where we could forecast, you had the forecast line, the trend line, over a period of 40 years, we did that for the raw electorate, we did that for the voter turnout, and we got some figures and we play with the figures and we observe certain trends over the course of 41 years of elections in Tobago. We don't have the luxury of 41 years of data in a 15-seat edition, right? We would have had 12 seats from 1980 all the way to January 2021. And then with the tie, the 6-6 PDP PNM, right, the EBC would have enacted some reforms so that we're now in a situation where we have an odd number of seats, that odd number being 15, so that we try to get as far away as possible from a situation where you can have two parties with the same number of seats. Now, you can have a third party winning 1 seat and 2 other parties winning 7 seats. So just as we had the 17-17-2 in the general elections of 1995, you can have 7-7-1 in Tobago. In that case, because you have an odd number of seats, you still have the possibility of that 1 seat forming a coalition with one of the 2 parties, just as would have happened in 1995 when the NAR would have formed a coalition with the UNC right? So again, all of this is part of the general thing of let we get to know the Tobago scene a little bit. Let we check it out. Let we see what's going on. Let we try to understand it a little bit, right? And I'm doing all this particularly for the Trinidadians who we really not familiar with the Tobago context, right? So one of the things I noticed in analyzing the Tobago elections of December 2021 was that some of the seats were pretty close, right? That is something that people would have been mentioning to me in my private conversations over the months. And then as I started checking it, I realized, yeah, boy, serious matters. So, for example, we know that P&M lost the Buku Mount Pleasant seat by 4 votes, right? And that's Ansel Dennis. And then Kelvin Morris won the Darrell Spring Wim seat by 3 votes. Can't get much closer than that, right? Even Signal Hill Patience Hill, 21 votes the PDP won by. Plymouth Blackrock, PDP won by 83 votes. These 4 seats, the percentage difference between the winning party and the losing party was less than 5%, right? So P&M won Darrell Spring Wim by 0.2%. PDP won Buku Mount Pleasant by 0.2%. PDP won Signal Hill Patience Hill by 1.1%. And PDP won Plymouth Blackrock by 4.4%. So those 4 seats where the margin of victory was less than 5%, I would make a reasonable conjecture that those 4 seats are the most likely to flip in terms of going into the P&M column, and that is why I put those 4 seats as likely P&M. Right? We will discuss a couple of the non-mathematical factors that could influence all of this in a little bit. All right? On the other end of that, on the other extreme, end extreme, same thing. On the other extreme of that continuum, you have 5 seats that the PDP won by a large margin. 3 of those seats were won by margins between 20 and 30%. And 2 of those seats were won by margins between 30 and 40%. Right? So Bethesda, Lekoto, I almost say Lescoto, you know. Lekoto, French. So Bethesda, Lekoto, PDP won by 28.9%. Mason Hall, North Moriah, remember we have some name changes and stuff like that. Check it out in the article. Mason Hall, North Moriah, these are the names that we're going to be using in January 2026. Mason Hall, North Moriah, PDP won by 29.5%. Roxborough, Argyle, PDP won by 29.8%. Belgarden, Glamorgan, PDP won by 34.5%. And Palatuve, Lansford, East Speyside, PDP won by 37.6%. So, those 5 seats I would consider likely to remain in the PDP camp, just based on the difference alone, because winning by that kind of margin, that is the kind of margin that will give you some cushion. You have a little wiggle room. So if you win a seat by 34.5 last time, you could afford to lose 20% and still win the seat by 14.5%. Right? You don't have that kind of wiggle room in the seats that we just discussed, where the margin of victory was less than 5%. So the slightest change there, I think, flip towards the P&M. The seats that we just discussed with the big margins, those should stay solidly in the PDP camp, absent a massive, a monumental shift in the political ground, right? We will discuss that a little bit soon. Just now, as we like to say in local parlance. So between those two, you have 4 in the PNM camp and 5 in the PDP camp. That is 4 and 5, 9. You have 6 seats in the middle. That I put them as purple. Red and blue is purple, right? I think, right? You know, they say men not too good with the colors and things, but right? You know the point I'm trying to make here. So we have 6 seats in the middle. That to me, all things being equal, and they may not be, but we're starting out from a perspective of if everything, barring any massive tectonic shift, as we like to say. We have 4 in the PNM camp, we have 5 in the PDP camp. We're starting off with that. And in the middle, you have 6 now, where 3 of the seats were won by the PDP with victory margins between 5 and 10%. And the other 3 were won by victory margins between 10 and 20%. Let me say that again because I'm tired. And when I'm tired, I make some silly mistakes with these things. Somehow I'm not sure that I say the right thing there just now, so I'm going to say it again. You have 6 seats in the middle, all you're getting real candid stuff. All let's show this video is not AI. Right? You have 6 seats in the middle, 3 of which were won by the PDP with a margin of victory between 5 and 10%. Those are Lambo Lowlands, 7.8%, Scarborough Mongrace, 7.8% as well, and Mason Hall South, Bacolet, 8.3%. Those are the respective margins of victory. And then there were 3 more that they won with a margin of victory between 10 and 20%. Bonaccord Crown Point, they won that by 14.1%. Mount St. George, Goodwood, they won that by 16.1%. And Bethel Newgrange, they won by 18.5%. All right? So in other words, those 3 leaning more towards the PDP, right? Bonaccord Crown Point, Mount St. George, Goodwood, and Bethel Newgrange. And then you have Lambo Lowlands, Scarborough Mongrace, and Mason Hall South Bacolet leaning more towards the PNM in terms of just looking at the voter differential alone. All right? So let me start out with a plateau of 4 in the PNM camp, 5 in the PDP camp. You have 6 in the middle. So if the PDP take those 6, Bonaccord, Crown Point, Mount St. George, Goodwood, and Bethel Newgrange, you have 5 and 6, 5 and 3, 8. So election done there already. PNM on the other hand would be 4. Dallas Pingwim, Bucco, Mount Pleasant, Signal Hill, Patience Hill, Plymouth, Backrock. And if they manage to pull in Lambo Lowlands, Scarborough Mongrace, and Mason Hall Bacolet, they will go up to 7. So, based on the numbers alone, we will get to the non-numerical factors in a little bit. Based on the numbers alone, a 8-7 victory for the PDP seems to be a likely result. Everything else being equal. Right? Everything else being equal. So in other words, with a regular schmegler, as I like to see. If everything regular schmegler, PNM regroup and they come back and maybe have some disaffection with Farley Augustine and whatever, right? People vex or whatever it is. Yeah, PNM might, they're very likely to pull in those 4 seats that we just mentioned, and they could pull in the Lambo Lowlands, the Scarborough Mongrace, and the Mason Hall South Bacolet. There's 7. If things not too rocky, they mightn't get much further than that. Because the Bonaccord, Crown Point, Mount St. George, Goodwood, and Bethel Newgrange, yeah, those margins of victory still leave the PDP with a little cushion to absorb some of the shock that might come if some people decide nah boy, I switch him a vote. Right? And remember, all of this would be tied into the voter turnout. Because if the voter turnout jump beyond 60.1, beyond 60.2, 61, 62, 63, 64, anything in the mid 60s, and I feel that the PNM could pull Bonaccord, Crown Point, Mount St. George, Goodwood, and Belton New Grange as well. So if the voter turnout is very high, and very high being relative, of course, relative to the entire Tobago context over the 41 years, a 65% voter turnout, that would be a very high voter turnout. A 65%, anything from 65, anything up to 65, let me say 60 to 65, yeah. I think the PNM, in addition to pulling the tree, we need to go back on the thing there, you know. Let me go back on the thing there, because I see in the seats written out on my board here, but all I ain't seen it, right? And remember talking to Trinidadians here now, so I want all to see the thing when I'm talking about the thing. So hold on, let me switch across. Let me go back. We'll come back on the board afterwards. Okay, so we come back across now to the screen where you could see all of the seats as I mentioned them. So the first thing I want to do, I think I have been saying PDP all the time, but in this election, what we will be dealing with will be the TPP, not the PDP, because we know there was that particular issue between Watson Duke and Farley, and they had the split after the one in 2021, December, etc., etc. So even though the figures that we have been discussing would have been PDP figures from December 2021, those figures would now feed into any kind of speculation at all that we might want to engage in for 2026. But instead of speculating on the PDP, we're now speculating on the TPP, because it is the TPP, in fact, that now holds the 14 seats out of the 15 in the Tobago House of Assembly. All right, so just to wheel back again, we have the 4 seats here that I am looking at as likely PNM, starting with Darrell Spring Wim, which the PNM holds. That's the solitary PNM seat, the only PNM seat right now, right? Then we have Boko Mount Pleasant, Signal Patient Hill, and Plymouth Blackrock, as we would have discussed a while ago. Those seats would have been lost by the PNM by less than 5%. So, all things considered, we could say that if any seats at all flip, worst case scenario to the PNM, it should be these 3. So 3 plus the 1 that they already have, that's 4 seats we started with. On the other hand, we have 5 seats that PDP in 2021, but now held by the TPP. So 5 seats were won by the PDP with such a massive majority that it would take a tsunami level current on the ground for these results to be reversed. And you never know. You never know. We'll discuss them things in a little bit. All right? So I am starting with these 5 in the TPP column: Bethesda, Lekoto, Mason Hall, Moriah, Roxborough, Argyle, Belgarden, Glamorgan, and Palatuve, Lansformy, Speyside. These 6 in the middle here, just as we were discussing a while ago, these are the ones that I would say would actually decide the outcome of the election, all things being considered, in the absence of a political tsunami. These 6 seats would be the ones that would decide the election. So PNM starting with 4, they would need to win 4 out of these 6, according to my own projections, to win the election. Which means, based on the voter differential, we're talking Lambo Lowlands, Scarborough Mount Grace, Mason Hall, Bacolet, and 1 out of these 3, which, if we go in on the numbers alone, would more than likely be Bonaccord, Crown Point. So if the PNM wins 4 of these here, and they win the first 4 on top, Lambo Lowlands, Scarborough Mongrace, Mason Hall South Bacolet, Bonaccord, Crown Point. That is the minimum that they would require to win the election outright. And then, of course, they could pose a challenge in the remaining two, Mount St. George, Goodwood, and Bethel, Newgrange. On the other hand, for TPP, we started them off with 5, which means that they only need to win 3 out of these seats in the middle here to win the election outright. And from their end, the 3 we're looking at would be Bethel, Newgrange, Mount St. George, Goodwood, and Bonaccord, Crown Point, which is to say that all things being equal, if there is no political earthquake on the ground, then the TPP would hold on to these 5 and then they could hold on to Bethel, Newgrange, Mount St. George, Goodwood, and Bonaccord, Crown Point. So that would be their 8, which is the minimum that you require for majority in a 15-seat assembly. And then, of course, they too would be in a position to challenge for the remaining 3 seats. So, worst case scenario, and this is numbers only, remember, and we're going to discuss that now. The numbers say one thing, but the other factors could influence that. So if we just go in on pure numbers alone, absent a huge shift, a tectonic shift, as we say, I think I used that phrase already. We're looking at 5 here for the TPP, these 5, and these 3 here. 5 and 3, 8, and we're looking at the PNM picking up 3 more in addition to the 1 that they already have, and picking up these 3 here as well. That, I believe, is what should happen with a voter turnout of between 53% and 60%. Anywhere in there, you're not really sure how it could go. However it goes would depend on the other factors. So I, as a Trinidadian from South, with little to no knowledge of the non-mathematical factors on the ground in Tobago, that is what I come up with when I analyze the thing so far. All right, so now we're going to go across, we're going to go back to the board now, and we will sum up the whole conversation by discussing some of the non-mathematical variables that could throw all of that out. Right? So we here talking about 8-7 one way or the other, or possibly 9-6. Right? Somebody might win 10-5 or 11-4. You might have a 14-1 again, or you might have a 15-0 again. Who knows? 12-3. Yeah. You know? So, Bonaccord Crown Point is the center of the action here, based on that little preliminary thing there. 5 and 2-7. Then they'll need to get Bonaccord Crown Point. That's the TPP side. And on the PNM side, you have 4 and 3-7. And then you have to get Bonaccord Crown Point. Remember, all of these things are listed in order of the voter differential. All right? From least to greatest. Right? Least going down. And then we come here again, least going down. And then they come here again, least going down. All right? Nice. So back to the board now. All right. So we're back on the board now. Right, I like this session where we switch from the board to the screen and the screen back to the board. Right, so I want to end the entire discussion by just discussing very briefly some of the non-political factors that could take all of the numerical analysis we just went through and all of the numerical analysis that anybody else may go through and just toss it out to the window. Right? Now, there may be people on the ground with more information than me, who might have a much better sense of what is likely to happen on the 12th of January. All right, the reason why I'm saying that is because when PNM won 12-0 in 2013, I do not know that many people in Trinidad expected that result. right? Yes, PNM would have been running the THA for about a couple cycles before that, but to win all the seats, I don't think the Trinidadians were expecting that. But I was able to talk to people and found out that there were people on the ground in Tobago who were actually saying that PNM would win all 12 seats. So you never know, right? There may be people with more information who might be able to say yay or nay or no way to any of the things that I would have done there, right? So the fact, bearing in mind that I am operating with just the EBC figures, I will play brave and jump in the Tobago people thing and talk about things that I might know too much about, right? So just following the election campaign for the THA elections, one issue in particular stood out to me as a non-mathematical issue that could have the potential to have an outsized effect on the results of the THA election. And that issue is the Tobago radar, the radar in Tobago, the US Army radar. As we know, there's this situation going on between the US and America, between the US and America. Woo! That is what has happened when you're lacking sleep, even though I just got about 4 hours. But we know it's... So there's this issue between the US and Venezuela where the US would have installed the radar in Tobago and all of that. And from what we could tell, looking on from a distance, there seems to be a lot of disquiet, a lot of discomfort with respect to the radar in Tobago, right? So much so that during the election campaign, about 2 or 3 of the other parties, the opposition parties, actually had a joint press conference on the issue, right? So imagine you have an election with TPP as the ruling party, PNM as the main opposition party, and some of the other parties, and all of the opposition parties came together to actually have a press conference, right? That is something that in the regular scheme of things would normally be an indicator that the level of disquiet on the ground is so great that it could prompt all of the opposition parties to unite to hold a press conference to address the issue. And if that translates to votes on the ground, it could very well mean that a lot of people, or a significant number of people, or some people, or a few people who may not normally be regular PNM voters, they would probably vote for the PNM just to make sure, or to do their part to make sure that the TPP does not win the 2026 THA elections. And in fact, I did see a video where the guy was talking to that effect. I cannot remember the gentleman's name now, right? But apparently this is a guy who would have worked with some of the TPP and PDP MPs and things before, and he was saying that he going to make sure PNM win this election, right? This wasn't coming from a PNM person, right? So if you could get little pockets of people who are not known to be PNM people saying that they're going to help PNM win the election, that's, if enough people have that sentiment, we can see something bigger than we expecting based on what happened in 2021, right? Because in the regular scheme of things, a party with 14 seats, at that point, you had to hold on to your 14, or you're basically going down now in terms of the number of seats, right? Now, at 14, you could hold on to your 14 and maybe win the remaining one, who knows? But we expect the TPP to lose seats in this election. Most people expecting that. When the PNM had 12 in 2013, the next election they went down from 12 to 10. That's 2017. And then by 2021, January, they went down from 10 to 6. And then between January 2021 and December 2021, they went down from 6 to 1. All right? So from 10 to 1, Sparrow say 10 to 1 is murder, right? 10 to 1, that would have been 17 to 21. Remember, we did a little analysis. We did a trend line for 2017 to 2021. In that period, the PNM went from 10 seats to 1. And then, if you count the 2013, they would have gone from 12 seats to 1. So that is 12 to 1. So if 10 to 1 is murder, what 12 to 1 is? We go figure out that. Right? So we expect TPP to lose seats as a general thing. Whether they lose enough seats to lose the entire election remains to be seen. And that would depend on the strength and the intensity of the non-mathematical factors, the emotional factors, the political factors, which always is what would determine the results of a democratic election. So if, notwithstanding the talk from various spokespersons, if the sentiment on the ground is not strong enough to propel a large enough number of Tobagonians to go out to vote against the TPP, then the TPP would win the election. Right? Whether it's 8-7 or 9-6 or 10-5 or whatever, remains to be seen. Right? Because sometimes we know how the politics could be sometimes. Sometimes people talk. And then when it's time to go out and do something about what they're talking about, they ain't doing it. They talk and they stay home on election day. People do that. So if that is what happens in Tobago, then yeah, the TPP would have a fighting chance. Right? If, however, the issue of the radar is the issue that drives the voter turnout into the 60s, it wouldn't have to reach 70% for PNM to win the election. Because if, remember, the voter turnout in the last election was 57%, which is low even by THA standards. Right? 57%. Right? So, if the radar is the issue, and the radar is the issue that causes the voter turnout to jump from 57% to, let me say, 60%, just 60, let me start with 60, a 3% difference in voter turnout in terms of extra voters. If the radar is the issue, then yeah, PNM will win. And the reason I'm saying that is because if 3% extra people come out to vote, to vote on the radar issue, then what that suggests, it would mean that some of the people who voted for PDP in the last election would change their vote to vote for the PNM, because they too would be riled up about the radar issue. Enough of those people would change their vote to cause the pendulum to swing from TPP to the PNM. Right? So it all depends on the strength of the emotional issue in the election. That remains to be seen. As a Trini from South, I have no real way of knowing, right, how strong the sentiment is. I had to wait like everybody else. The most I could do is speculate. Right? And as I said before, I'm doing this because I never really took the time to sit down and study the figures in the Tobago situation. I mean, I would have discussed the Tobago things with Tobagoans over the years, right, on a number of occasions. But to say, well, all right, here what, we're going into the EBC website, we're going to check out the Tobago states, we're going to check out the Tobago votes, we're going to check out the Tobago parties. No, this is the first time I'm doing it. So it's a nice experience. I'm really enjoying it because it allows me to add to whatever I do in terms of analyzing the politics by the numbers. There may be other issues as well, right? There may be Tobagonians who are not happy with the degree of cooperation between the present TPP administration and the UNC administration. There may be Tobagonians who may not be happy with just Fali himself, right? That is a thing, right? You're running the country, you're running the place, for whatever reason, sometimes with the best of intention and the best of performance, some people don't like what you're doing. And if enough people develop a negative sentiment towards Fali, then that too will show up in the election results on the 12th of January. Right? I'm trying to think of other issues that might, I don't know. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Right? The regular issues that would come up in any political environment, money thing and corruption thing and people thing, and yeah, that's par for the course, as we like to say. But I don't really have a strong grasp of those. I could talk about what I see, which is the radar, right? And the general way in which the TPP appears to just be going along with what the UNC is doing as the central government in terms of just going along with whatever it is the Americans want, right? And from the little that I know of the Tobago electorate, they probably would just keep their cards close to the chest. I mean, I've seen some of the interviews on TV where most of the people that were interviewed didn't say who they voted for. There was one guy in particular who said that he don't usually vote, but he coming out to vote. That to me was telling, because if there are more people like him who don't usually vote, but they coming out to vote this time, that would suggest a level of discontent on the ground with something. More than likely it could be the radar. It might be some other thing or some other things, plural. If there are many more people like him, if there are, and it don't even have to be many, you know, it just had to be enough, right? Because you would have seen the margins of victories that we would have discussed earlier on. 21 seats. I seen one there, 130 seats, that's Scarborough Mount Grace. 136 seats, Mason Hall, Bacolod. Right? 128 seats, Lambo Lowlands. That's a margin that could be overturned like that. Right? And there's the 3 seats that the PNM might be looking to pull from the middle section we just discussed there. Right? 83 seats. How many seats? Votes. 83 votes, Plymouth Blackrock. 21 votes, Signal Hill, Patience Hill. And of course, we discussed Buku Mount Pleasant, 4 votes. Dallas Spring, 3 votes. Yeah. Right? Sometimes it might just take 2 or 3 large families in an area to switch. Yeah, that is how the thing does go sometimes. So we will see how that play out on the 9th of the 12th. All right? So that more or less is it in terms of me going where few Trinidadians would want to go, because there is a general sense in which we don't want to interfere with the Tobago people thing. We don't know about the Tobago people thing. Especially if, like me, you don't really have a strong family connection directly into Tobago, right? You really wouldn't know unless you talk to Tobagonians and get a sense, right? So I went a step further this time and I actually went into the numbers, right? And again, I want to say a special big up to the Elections and Boundaries Commission, who, in my humble opinion, continues to be a shining example for the entire world, not just for the country or the region or the Western Hemisphere, to the world. And if there is one thing that I discussed it already, so let me not go there. Right? Let me just say big up to the EBC and leave it at that. Right? And I want to encourage folks, those of us who inclined to do so and who could make the time, do it. The numbers are out there, the data is out there. Right? You could go in and play up with the figures. Right? Because this is the kind of thing that the political parties routinely do. They have their analysts, but they don't usually share their findings with the public because they analyzing for their own information to inform their own strategy and their own campaign. The members of the public now have the ability via the EBC website to do the same or similar things to what I just did there, and you could get your own information for yourself. Or you could wait and let me do it and come and explain it for you. Right? The nice thing about this is that nobody, not a single person, came to me and said, hey, you ain't doing nothing for the THA elections. Hey, what is your views on the THA elections? Normally, for national elections, people would expect me to do something with the numbers and they would ask what I'm thinking. Nobody came this time, which was great for me because it is nice to be able to surprise people. Nobody ain't looking out for this THA analysis. No. But we try a thing. In my humble opinion, given what I was working with by way of information, I don't think I did too badly. We will wait and see how the results unfold. All right? So take care, everybody, and stay in touch. Remember, I will put links to the actual written articles that goes along with this video on the relevant conversation, comments, threads on the different social media platforms. I encourage you strongly to read it because there's some more detail in there that I didn't go into on the video itself. And just as I end the video, I want to say a quick word to the writers in the country, the people who like to write. Because when you look at the Substack, you will see that I was able to include pictures, I was able to include galleries, right? I was able to include links to subscribe. You could put pictures, you could put videos and all of that. So those of us in the country who like to write, those of us in the country who have things to say, I am encouraging you strongly to use the Substack app. Most of us, Facebook is fine because Facebook, easy diffusion. Somebody shared and then you have the whole comments and thing. No problem. You could do Facebook too, you know. But the Substack is a lot more robust. It's a much better place if you're a writer. So I want to encourage the writers among us, sign up for Substack, get yourself an account. And if we could build a Trini ecosystem, not eco, if we could build a Trinidadian and Tobagoan ecosystem of writers on Substack, that will be a big part of whatever political activity and whatever political activism that there may need to be now and in the future. Any kind of political activism always requires some level of intellectual stimulus. Writers, poets, speakers, people who generating ideas, people who discussing ideas, people who debating, people who presenting solutions, right? And for those of us who want to wield the power of the pen, in this 2026, even better than Facebook, from a pure writing standpoint, your Substack. And of course, you could share the link on Facebook, just as I would have done for this particular series here. So, that's it. Boom.